A Plague Tale Requiem. It's a continuation of a game that came out a couple of years ago called A Plague Tale's Innocence. This game came out of nowhere basically for a very unknown studio at the time, at least for me, called Asobo Studios, who today is better known for his collaboration with Microsoft on Flight Simulator. One of the things that made the game impact so big was the fact that it came from these unknown studios, but also because it was using this technology created by them. It's refreshing in this day and age where everybody seems to be using Unreal or Unity. Indie studio comes up with its own engine and also has this great amazing graphics, because for a, let's say, AA developer, it was very good. So following that first game, we have now the continuation, which promises to improve on everything the first one did, in terms of technology at least. It's even supposed to bring ray tracing at some point, which at the moment is still not active, at least not officially. And I have to say that the game brings a lot of improvement in graphical terms. It looks quite good, the scope is bigger, and you can see this nice bokeh effect on everything on the background, because the game uses a lot of trickery to make the world looks much better, than it actually is, like 2D elements on the background very far that start becoming 3D as you are getting closer, but because of that bokeh, it's kind of hiding that effect. It's also using mega scan textures, which you can appreciate in any of these images that I'm showing on a screen, and they look really beautiful and very realistic. However, the textures tend to break when you get close to them, and I'm not sure if this is a problem of the engine or of the actual textures and the way they work. However, in general, they look amazing with these expansive scopes and really beautiful scenery of the France of the Renaissance, or I'm not quite sure the times where this is happening, but as you can see, everything looks very realistic and very well done. Here you can see a little bit of what I was saying before about the textures. You see that when you get close to them, the illusion of reality starts to break, and as I said, I'm not quite sure if this is a problem with the engine or is a problem with the actual textures. However, the lighting and the texturization in general is so rich and beautiful that this is not something that you are going to be honestly looking at. The way the wind interacts with everything makes the game more realistic and everything feels alive. The characters are recreated with absolute exquisite. When you see how the subsurfaces scattering penetrate the skin and bounce back, creating this illusion of reality, the stitches on the clothes and the texture, everything is done with absolute mastercraft, I have to say. However, all of this doesn't mean that the game is perfect. There are different areas which I believe need more work. Not talking about optimization yet, which will come. One is the animations. They don't look that great. They seem to be hand created instead of motion capture, which means that many times you're going to see characters talking and they are not really expressing what is happening on the screen. It's not to say that they are bad and you won't see this as much on cinematic, but on normal gameplay, many characters' faces will not animate at all, basically, which breaks the illusion, of these characters, because they are laughing or doing something and it doesn't look at all like they are. So this sort of break the illusion. Also, another issue is the normal animation of running and so on. It looks very good, but it's also there is something missing that doesn't make it look as realistic. And well, this is the result of this being an indie title somehow, and where the technical limitations are apparent, especially when we start talking about optimization, because as good as the game looks, it's also going to force you to use such hardware that it doesn't what you see on the screen and the hardware moving it doesn't relate. It seems like you're using 3 times the hardware than you need. Another problem that the game has is with the LOD. The LOD happens too close to screen, and you can see that on shadows and on the geometry that is creating the different shapes. For example, there is a fruit stand, and you're going to see in the cinematic that the fruits become complete in front of your eyes, and this is something I really don't like. I don't know when they are going to allow for people, at least with the necessary hardware, to push the LOD as far away as possible, because for me, when you start getting close to something and things start to form in front of your eyes, it breaks the illusion completely. I understand this is very heavy and taxing on hardware. However, with RTX 4090s on the market, it should be for the owner to decide how important or how they want to activate this. So I hope this changes soon. Having said this, you know, I still think that, problems aside, this is a game that doesn't look like an indie game. When you see this running and playing, it's just a joy. Graphically is amazing, and the game points out to, you know, showing that there is more beyond AAA games, that also indie studios, 2-day production are amazing these days, and you can get an amazing technical experience even on a smaller studio. That not everything is, you know, needs to be the God of War or the Cyberpunk of the world. So one thing about this is that the game looks good on every preset the game has, which is ultra, high, medium and low. The difference between ultra and low are not that big. It's mostly some tessellation, some reduction in geometry, and this LOD distance and some shadows. But in general, the difference is not that big when we go from ultra to low. So that means that the game tries to adapt to as many hardware as possible. However, having said that, we are going to see that this is probably still not great, because that means that because the difference is so small that you are not going to get much performance from going from ultra to low. For example, here you can see the difference. We go from around 67 frames to 81 frames going from ultra to low, which, you know, is not that much. I would say it's around 15 to 20% increase between the highest to the lowest. And the problem is that could sound a lot, but if you're getting just 30 FPS at ultra, that means you're not going to get 60 at low, especially with this game that is as heavy as this is, and we're going to see about that in a little bit. And I am not quite sure where the problem is with this game optimization. When we use photo mode, we can see that there are so many assets that we don't even see because they are under, for example, the floor. They don't intercept, so a full asset has to be rendered even if it's not being shown, just because when it's under that ceiling is a full asset, so it needs to render it. So this game has so many unused assets for using like a little piece of it, that I'm not quite sure why this is. I know there are techniques that the engines use it that hides whatever you can see, but when that asset is a complete piece, you cannot just hide a piece of the asset. So you technically are rendering this whole thing even though you're only showing a little piece of it. So in the photo mode you can see it because, well, you can clip through everything and just see what's happening. There is lights and other stuff inside places that you're not supposed to get in, that I don't know what the point of those are. So I don't know if this is what is making this game be so heavy and so unoptimized. It's like they just built this world in the easiest way possible. So to test how CPU dependent this game is, what I did was running the game on an old CPU that I have, which is an Intel i7 6700K that is 7 years old. It's not the slowest CPU on the market, but it's not the fastest. So this will give me an idea of how CPU dependent, because this is a 4 cores 8-thread CPU. So what I did is put the game on very 720p and on ultra, just to avoid having any problems with the GPU. As you can see, the GPU is only used at around 60%. So I know there is not a GPU bottleneck. Whatever is happening here is a CPU bottleneck. So when I test ultra and then I test low, I see if there is any difference in performance. If I see any difference, it means that there is a option in the game for the graphics that is also affecting the CPU. And yes, there was difference. And yes, as you imagine, what makes a difference between CPUs is the draw distance. Obviously, this needs to prepare more geometry when the draw distance is higher. So obviously, it will affect the CPU. So if you're having any issues trying to get those 60 frames, or you want that extra push, you can lower the draw distance of objects, if that's something that is going to help. It's the only graphical option that is going to make a difference to your CPU, okay? And I think that, well, it's a nice trick there for you to try to squeeze as much performance as you can from this game, because oh boy, is this game heavy, and it's heavy by a lot. So having said this, then we are going to see that this game is not only heavy on the CPU, and we need to cut the draw distance in order to get a little bit more depending on what sort of hardware you have. But you're going to see that this game is also ridiculously heavy on GPU power, which is something that, you know, my eyes sort of deceive me. You know, you expect when you see something behaving in some way, you say, okay, is what I'm seeing on the screen justifying this use of power? And for me, the problem here is I don't think this game is justifying how much power it requires. Remember, the official specs are asking you for 3070 to move this game at 1080p 60 frames per second without ray tracing. For example, when we test on my main PC, and I need to explain here that what I look for is not how many frames you can get. What I try with my analysis is to show you sort of what do you need in order for this game to be playable, either at 30 FPS in the worst case scenarios, or at 60 FPS, which is the objective. Normally, sometimes we cannot achieve that. In this case, I'm playing with the RTX 4090 on a 12600K using 4K Ultra and DLSS in quality. The reason I'm using DLSS in quality, even though I don't need it and I can get to 60 frames per second and more without it, is because I want to just have that nice anti-alias that DLSS quality brings that the game doesn't have, so I can have a little bit of a better image. But also, it will assure me that I have enough GPU power to never be under, because this is a game that is very erratic. On a moment, you are going to be able to play at 1440p with your GPU, and then the next chapter you are going to be around 45 frames per second when you were at 60 before, and you will need to lower to 1080p, which makes that this game is lacking on some options that will help reduce this problem, and we are going to talk about that later on the video. But as you can see here with the RTX 4090, there is not much to say or see, and with the CPU you just crank everything up and you can obviously play this game at 4K, at least at 60 frames per second on very stable configuration. So there is no magic here, but we are going to continue testing just to give you my option with other hardware. When we check with the 3060 Ti, unbelievable, I have to put this game in 1440p high, but I still use DLSS quality, and as you can see, the game is not running perfectly fine. And this is what I'm saying. This game goes from one end of the spectrum to the other. Initially, I thought my CPU, on this case the Intel i5 100F that I'm using for this test was not enough for these games to get to 60 frames per second. But that's not the limiting factor here. Even though it sounds bizarre to me that what our goal is not 120 frames, what we want is just 60 frames per second. And it sounds bizarre that a 6-core CPU 12 thread like this, which is very fast, cannot get even to 60. So well, as I said, this game is absolutely unoptimized and there are many issues, and the game still doesn't even include ray tracing, and that, you know, kind of explain a lot of the problems that we're seeing with this game and why it runs so poorly on consoles, which we're going to be talking also a little bit later on the video. Many of the cinematic on the game instead run quite good, and that must be probably because they are always close up and very close, and you can see that the CPU usage in these ones go down very much. I think it's a more controlled environment, which is normally different from what happened for many other games, because many other games, when they go to the cinematic, what it happens instead is that the quality of the assets is better, making the cinematic even heavier than the actual game. But this is not what's happening here, and I think it's because of this, you know, indie route that the game has, where they don't seem to have optimized geometry as much as they should have, putting all, you know, the weight of the game on you having enough horsepower to brute force your way through the game. From my point of view, a 3060 Ti should be able to speed through this game. And yes, I am a little bit conservative on the specs I'm using, but you saw the results before, and there are places where you're going to be only using 60% of GPU like right now, but then it's going to be using 100% and not going to be enough. And that's what I think this game needs urgently, a dynamic resolution option. So the game, you can set it up at 1440p, but maybe when the game is too heavy, then it will lower itself up to 1080p instead of you having to be limiting the game to 1080p from the beginning. But this game doesn't have that option and doesn't support XeSS or FSR, which is another problem that we are going to be facing through this game, because the only reconstruction option this game has is DLSS. But as we continue checking, you can see that the game right now is running at 80%, 70% of CPU usage and 70% GPU usage. So this area here, even though not much is happening, is one of the most heavy areas in the game, at least that I could find of. So maybe a better CPU will have given me a better result, but as you can see, it jumps all over the place. Now it's 80, 70, 60, 55. It makes absolute no sense. Why, when the geometry on the screen is not changing that much? And I think it's because what I mentioned before, many of the constructions that this game has are probably hidden, but still being rendered because they are part of a bigger, you know, asset that they are using to show just a couple of things, which make everything a little bit crazy from my point of view, that the game is constructed in that way. I don't know if this is a problem of resources, they are using all their development thing on the Microsoft Flight Simulator game, or what's going on, but from my point of view, this is not acceptable in terms of performance. Now when we get to test with an RTX 2060 6GB, then I tested at 1440p and the game sometimes runs at 60 FPS, but as I said, that you can be on one place and then change, and it will change completely, that it will tank your performance, that if you want to have a smooth experience throughout, then you need to go always with better or more conservative settings. In this case, I had to put 1080p and DLSS quality mode, and right now it's running very stable at 60 frames per second. As you can see, the CPU usage is very low compared to what we were seeing with the 3060, even though we have the rats on a screen. So that makes no sense, right? And the reason, I think, is because this is a closed environment, and what we were seeing before was sort of an open environment. So it right now is running very well, and it's only using around 70 to 80% GPU usage. When we go out, If we were using a higher preset, then the frame rate will tank, because even though here it could run at 1440p with DLSS, even on balance, then when we go out, things change for the worse. And that's the reason this game is so weird. It's like they didn't, control what we call the budget of geometry to keep a smooth performance. They have no control, or they don't care about it, which is weird considering right now we are looking at what is supposed to be one of the heaviest things, which is all these rats running around. However, as I said, with a 2060, if you put this game at 1080p, high quality on DLSS quality, you are going to have a very good experience and a very stable, at least 60 frames per second. Now this is the weird part. With the AMD RX 6600 XT, the game was running very well in that area before that we were looking at 1440p. However, when this scene started, the game tanked and went to 45 frames per second. So I had no option but to realize that this card is supposed to be playing at 1080p to get to those 60 frames per second, which you can see it gets under it for a while. But as I said, the problem is that this game doesn't support FSR, which I think it would have been amazing, and I think it will be added over time. But it would have been amazing to, keep the game at 1440p with an FSR in quality or balance mode and have a very nice experience. But right now, as it is, all I can do is lower the resolution, because even using 85% of 1440p was not enough to keep a sort of stable performance. This is when I said this card is very similar to what a PlayStation 5 is. It's almost exactly as a PlayStation 5. And as you know, this game on PlayStation 5 runs at 1440p at 30 FPS, which we will have been able to achieve with these cards, no problems whatsoever. However, we can see that at 1080p we can achieve 60. The problem is those 60 are not stable. So the question now is, why didn't Asobo give the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox Series X a 1080p 60 frames per second option? I understand that they are also using reconstruction on consoles, option that is not available here on the PC, so I'm not sure if that adds some overhead that makes that the 1080p 60 is not possible unless you use reconstruction, and then that goes back to 50 frames per second or something. But with a 6600 XT we can achieve those 60 frames at least at 1080p. Continue with some AMD. Well, I use the RX 5080 to try to play with this, and you are going to have to limit your frame rate at 30 FPS, because the game really never gets even close to 60 unless you lower your resolution to like 540p and play on low. So at that point I prefer to just limit it to 30 FPS and put it on high and have a better experience. And I said, if this game had dynamic resolution or FSR or even both, maybe we could get to a certain compromise where we can get the game to run at 60 frames per second, even if it's not a native resolution. But that will have been an option, which I think is much better than just playing at 540p without reconstruction, which looks very bad for this sort of modern games. So the same principle applies to the 1060. However, in this case I have to say that you have to play on low, because on high you're not going to get the same performance stability that we're seeing right now, which is 30 frames flat. With the 580 it seems to have that extra performance that allows the game to run with high setting. However, as I said, honestly, the difference between high and low is not that big in terms of graphic fidelity, so you're not going to be missing much, especially when most areas are closed like this, because many of the settings will change things when it comes to open areas. Yes, it also changed some shadow and so on, but as you can see, the game on low still looks very good. And to think that a 1060 or a 580 can still play this game at 1080p 30 FPS, well, I think it's an achievement, and a good one, considering many people with PlayStations 4 or Xbox cannot play this game in any way, not even at 30 FPS. So we can say that your GPU is lasting longer than those two consoles. And yeah, I had to test the Intel Arc 750. Of course, I'm going to be bringing a more complete benchmark and analysis of the Intel Arc 750, but since this was the first game I got after the card arrived, then I decided to put it to the test. And one thing I want to say is that the first time I tested this game, the performance was atrocious. It was so bad that I thought there had to be a problem with the driver, or that the CPU was not good enough to move this game at 60 frames per second, and I was worried about it. And then I realized that what happened is that I had a BIOS update of my motherboard which reset all my settings and remove or disable the option for resizable bar. Then I reactivated resizable bar and the performance came back. This is a card that needs resizable bar. It needs it. It's not optional. If you buy this card and you don't have a CPU motherboard that supports resizable bar, you are going to be losing at least 40% of performance. So that is something very important you need to keep in mind. Now, I have to say I am very surprised about the performance of this game, because we are achieving the same 60 frames per second at 1080p high that we were achieving with the 6600 XT. And well, yes, the 6600 XT is cheaper at the moment, so the Intel Arc is not like a very good option, but you know, all things considered, I think this card is going to get other areas better than the 6600, like for example ray tracing, but I still have to test that, and we're going to be doing that in the next days or so. But as you can see, the Intel Arc here is behaving quite good, and I will say that if this game support the XeSS, we could get, or FSR, we could get even 1440p to move very good. As you see, the usage of the card is around 60 to 70%, so that means we can still get better performance out of this card. But remember, my objective with my benchmark analysis is not to tell you how crazy the game can go and so on, is finding that balance between resolution, graphical quality and performance, and telling you what to expect. So you know, depending on the sort of hardware you have, sort of what you can expect to play the game at. So you know, with the RX 580 that you should, you know, lower your expectations and play at 30. That you can get to 60, of course, if you lower the resolution enough, but I'm giving you what I think is the best of both worlds, which is good quality, very good resolution, and maybe not the best performance in FPS terms, but still, you know, giving a very balanced and stable performance on the game. So as you can see from this game, I can say that Intel Arc is behaving quite good. Remember, this is the 750, which is supposed to be the lowest of the two cards that are in the market. So I hope you like my benchmark, my technical analysis. This is the sort of benchmark and technical analysis I do. I've done many of them in my Spanish channel. This is the first one I'm doing on my English channel, and I hope everything I said is clear and well explained, and it gave you an idea of how this game is going to behave on different configuration, on how the CPU benchmark work, how it's going to limit you, and to give you a whole idea. The next game I've been doing this is going to be probably Gotham Knights. So I hope that if you like this video, you are going to subscribe, like it and share it, so I can bring you more content like this. Please subscribe and see you on the next video. Thank you.